grateful over the years for the ministry of John Blanchard, starting back in the 1960s. He's worked with the Movement for World Evangelization based in Britain, and then as his own ministry developed, I've bought my own copies of many of his books on James, illustrations for preachers, one of the more recent ones on Dawkins. I bought this one in 1970, but the one that I most appreciate is actually a Bible that John gave me at what was called the Filey Christian Holiday Crusade in England in 1970, when I won this in a contest. So I have his signature. About 43 years ago, I had no idea then that I'd be meeting him in South Africa 43 years later. I've got other signatures here like Stephen Alford and Billy Graham. So we're so glad to have you today. The Lord bless you in the rest of your ministry while you're here in Cape Town. And Lord bless you today as you minister to us.
I'm longing to meet somebody who heard me any time in the last 5 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But thank you very much for that and for the privilege of being here today towards the end of this tour of South Africa, to which I look forward to greatly. I was here, probably right here in the seminary 4 years ago, and dropped large hints wherever I went that this surely would be my last visit to your country. I began coming, I think, back in the 1980s, certainly in the 1980s, I don't think before then. And obviously there's going to be a last time, and I felt, well, why don't I drop large hints that this will be the last time, and then it won't be forced on me. But the people who invite me to come here always are Christian book discounters who are responsible for this display. You know well of their work, and if you don't, where have you been? They are rightly and importantly popular in Christian circles in South Africa because of the work that they do. So they increasingly twisted my arm until I was forced, kicking and screaming, to come back to South Africa on this time. And I'm glad I did. We've had Howard Williams, my colleague, and I have had a wonderful time, first of all in Gauteng for about a week, and then in Natal, and then here in Western Cape since Monday. And now it's just easing up, it's nice and gentle. 2 services tomorrow, 2 services on Sunday, and then home on Monday. So the rest of it's really like a holiday. And, I think I spoke 13 times in the first 5 days, so they're kind of warming me up. So we're getting near the end of that. And it's, you know, I guess that's quite a program for a man who was born in 19, none of your business. Quite a long time ago, and this is about the 4th day of my 52nd year in full-time Christian ministry. And so this is a good place to be bringing this particular trip to South Africa to an end. Now, I've been asked to speak on if I read things rightly, science and religion. That's last week's, but it's all right. Which is an interesting subject for me to speak on. Firstly, because I know nothing very much about science, and secondly, that I'm not very keen on religion either. I don't happen to believe that Christianity is a religion. I understand that we must talk about it in those terms because that's the only way people will understand what we're talking about, but there is a distinct difference between what I would call religions and Christianity, and the difference is that religions are going this way or trying to go this way to reach up to some being or other. Christianity is God coming down to us in the person of Jesus Christ and ministering to us in grace and truth. However, I act under instructions, and if the mighty Janet Greener or whoever else in CBD says you must speak on that, at that place, and of course if the inviting places who asked me, so the leadership here is responsible for this subject this morning, then it's nothing to do with me. I just speak on whatever I'm asked to speak on, provided they think I've got something to say on the subject. And the reason they do is that I do have a book, and I don't see it here because I think it's like a number of titles during this trip. It's now run out, it's sold out, and it's called Has Science Got Rid of God? which is a valid question that people ask, because it is assumed by many that science has done precisely that. In fact, I think we've reached the situation where Christians can become a little intimidated by the word science, as if scientists have said that, and then if that happens to relate to something that Christians believe, there are many Christians, not you hyper-educated lot here, but there are some Christians who back off a little bit and say, well, I mean, if scientists have said it, they've worked all day in the lab in a white coat, and therefore they must be telling the truth, and therefore maybe we haven't got it exactly right, we should back off a little bit. Well, that kind of response is frankly outdated and naive, and I think it would be a good idea to begin with a description of what science is. And this is my description of it. It's original, but I think it is a perfectly good working definition. Science is the ongoing process of discovering truth in the natural world. I just try to bear that in mind. Science is an ongoing process of discovering truth in the natural world. So it's not a fixed thing. It's not an end, it's a process towards an end. That's the difference. This podium is a finished product. Science is not a finished product. Science is a process. It is discovering truth, and as we'll see later, sometimes it says, no, that what we told you is true is not actually so. We have now discovered something else, so we will move on from there. For example, Sir Karl Popper, arguably the world's best-known philosopher of science, says, every scientific statement must remain tentative forever, unquote. Or Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty. Some unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. Now there is a brilliant Nobel laureate saying that. And here is Richard Dawkins, and we've all heard about Richard Dawkins. He is, well, let me describe him. He is the world's best known and most respected atheist. And I know that on very good authority. That was written by Richard Dawkins. I know that's who he is. And Richard Dawkins, as a scientist, is always ready to change his mind, unquote. I've not heard Dawkins change his mind about anything when it comes to attacking Christianity. Scientists used to tell us that the planets were held in space by something called ether. And that's what held them there. If you told a cutting-edge scientist today that that's what holds the planet in space, he'd probably die of laughter. Science is moving on and changes things as it makes honest new discoveries. So science is an ongoing process of discovering truth in the natural world. And true science is therefore a very humble thing. And it has its limitations. Now, I guess I got my limitations today, so I would have found out beforehand what they are. When am I supposed to finish?
You've got time until 11 o'clock.
I've got time until 11 o'clock. That's 45 more minutes. Goodness gracious. I can stand up for that long. Or if you could sit down for that long. Right. So, thank you for that. Science has its limitations, which is what the atheistic scientists will tell you. Here is Peter Atkins, who lectures in physical chemistry at Oxford University, and he said in a 1998 debate, quote, I am on the brink of discovering everything. That's what I thought. I'm on the brink of discovering everything, and I commend you to use your brains, because your brains are the most wonderful instruments in the universe. And through your brains, you will see that you can do without God. There is no necessity for God, because science can explain everything, unquote. So now you know. Science can explain everything, which sounds very exciting, but it's not actually science. It is instead something called scientism. And if you look up that word in a dictionary, you will see that it has a very different definition. Another word for scientism is nothing buttering. Another one, better known, is reductionism. So let me reverse the order of those and give them to you as you would most likely come across them technically. It is scientism, or it is reductionism. These are alternatives, they're just different names for the same thing. Or, as Donald Mackay in Scotland called it, it is nothing buttery. In other words, Scientism says that reality is nothing but atoms and molecules. So you get atoms and molecules, and once you've described those and got their place in the situation, that's it. There's nothing more to be said. So there is no reality outside of physical atoms and molecules. So that Dawkins can say truth means scientific truth. But it's so easy to dismantle that statement. Firstly, it's not a scientific statement. On its own terms, truth means scientific truth is not a scientific statement, it's just an empty soundbite. And secondly, a scientific description of something is not the only valid one. If after I have finished this morning, somebody on the staff kindly says, can I infuse some Camellia sinensis leaves in a liquid compound of oxygen and hydrogen for you, I would say, could you explain that, please? If they said, would you like a cup of tea, I'd jump at it. And I'm happy with rooibos, if that would suit you. So the scientific description is valid, but it's not the only one. There are other ways of describing the same thing. If you see a beautiful sunset, and you're standing there watching it with somebody, you may describe it in lovely, lyrical, colourful, even romantic terms, but a scientist might take 10,000 words to describe it in scientific terms. What exactly is causing the elements to act and react in a certain way that brings you those colours and gradations of colour and all the rest of it. But that doesn't mean that his scientific description is the only valid description. Thirdly, there are many things beyond the reach of science and the scientific method, which is, of course, observation and experiment. For example, scientists cannot tell us why the world came into being. Now, hear me carefully. Science cannot explain why the world came into being. Science will tell us, most modern science will tell us today, that our world originated in what is now known as the hot Big Bang, or more briefly, the Big Bang, about 15 billion years ago. But I'm a very simple guy, and I'm not a scientist, but if there was a Big Bang, I've got two questions. What is it that went bang? And where did the energy come that made it go bang? Well, you haven't thought of that. Well, the word that's commonly used is a singularity. It was a singularity. Now, for a layman like myself, a speck of dust would answer me. So there's a speck of dust. That may be much too big. Maybe it was 10 million times smaller than a speck of dust. But there was something, and then there was energy that made the whole thing go bang. Now, why did that happen? Why should it happen? Stephen Hawking, not to be confused with Richard Dawkins, the most easily recognizable scientist in the world, I'm sure, huddled in that little chair of his. In a book called Black Holes and Baby Universes, he said this: although science may solve the problem of how the universe began, it cannot answer the question, why does the universe bother to exist? I don't know the answer to that. Now, if Stephen Hawking doesn't know the answer to it, I'm blessed if I do. Because he is a very distinguished physicist. Second, science can't explain why there are natural laws and why they're so consistent and dependable. For example, the law of gravity says that a free-falling object accelerates at the rate of 981 centimeters per second. When I was at school, it was 32 feet per second, until they started messing around with feet and inches. But it amounts to the same thing, 981 centimeters per second. Who decided that? And you look up the records and say, oh, there was a subcommittee on the definition of the law of gravity, and they decided, hands up all in favor of 981, we'll make it that. You may be relieved to know the government didn't decide. Well, you look very relieved about that. Pardon me? They'll absolutely charge you for it. About 981 rand per second. But what science cannot do is explain why the law of gravity is as it is. All we've done is discover it. We've found it, we didn't form it. Thirdly, science can tell us that the human body has tens of thousands of kilometers of blood vessels, but it can't explain why we are persons. and not just blood processing machines. Fourthly, science can tell us that the human brain has 100 billion neurons, or nerve cells, the same number of trees that are growing in 2.7 million square miles of Amazonian rainforest. Now, science can tell us that those are the number of neurons the brain has, and that each one of them has up to 100,000 connections with other parts of the human body. Now, science can tell us that, but it cannot tell us why the mind exists, and why it functions as it does. Here's the Oxford biochemist Arthur Peacock. There is something about the mind, and therefore about who you really are, that science cannot get at. And fifthly, science can't explain ethical principles. Here is a very famous British geneticist and a passionate atheist called J.B.S. Haldane, and in 1945 he said this, quote, "Science can't give an answer to the question, why should I be good?" unquote. Now that's a pretty good question to ask. Every parent has been asked that question by their children. Why should I do this? Why shouldn't I do that? I want to do this, and so forth. And in your society and mine, that is in South Africa and in the UK, don't you think it's important to know what ethical principles are, and as to whether a thing is good or not good? Here is Dawkins again. Science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. I thought that was pretty important. And don't forget, all I'm doing at the moment is trying to show some of the limitations of science. I am not trying to show that science is no good or bad, or we don't want to touch it. I'm in favor of science. The more science, the better scientists, the better. But it does have limitations. John Lennox, who is either here or is about to be here, going around the universities and so forth, fine committed Christian and a fine Christian apologist too, a mathematician, Marxist, and he loves to put it like this. Science can tell you that if you feed somebody with strychnine, they'll die. It'll kill them. But science cannot tell you whether it is right or wrong to put strychnine in your grandmother's tea so that she'll die and you can have her property. Now, did you hear that? Science can't tell you whether it's right or wrong. So if you say, I'm about to put this in the old girl's tea, is it right or wrong? I mean the old lady's tea, excuse me. Is it right or wrong? When you ask science, science had nothing to say. Sixthly, science can't answer life's biggest questions. Here is Steve Jones, professor of genetics at the University of London and another passionate atheist. Science cannot answer the question that philosophers or children ask, why are we here? What is the point of being alive? How should we behave? Now, I talk to the students now. You are certainly at an age when surely those questions should be filling your minds, and you should be on the way to finding good answers to them. Why are we here? What's the point of being alive? How ought we to behave? So those are all limitations that science has. So the statement truth means scientific truth is illogical nonsense. And scientific knowledge is not the only form of knowledge. And thirdly, scientific knowledge can only take us so far. Now, that means that because we know there is other reality, there must be reality beyond the reach of science, which is not what atheistic scientists would tell us. So we quote Richard Dawkins again, this time on a BBC television program called Soul of Britain, quote, I think science really has fulfilled the need that religion did in the past, of explaining things. Explaining why we are here, what is the origin of life, where did the world come from, and what life is all about. Well, he's wrong. 4 times in one statement, which even for him is pretty good going. And let me show you why he's wrong. He says science can explain why we are here. Quote me any scientific discipline you can name that says this is why we are here. This is the meaning, the purpose of us being here. What is the origin of life? Well, science can't tell us that. If you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and read an article headed Life, the last sentence in the article will read there is no generally generally agreed definition of what life is, unquote. So how can Dawkins have the nerve to say, well, science can explain what the origin of life is when we don't even know what life is? I mean, we can't agree on a definition of what life is. And thirdly, where did the world come from? Well, science can't explain where the world came from. Even if it takes us back to a singularity, even if we assume that there was this singularity bobbing around, well, why was it there? And why did it go bang anyway? And then he also says that science can explain what life is all about. What's life all about? There was a television program not so long ago in England by Stephen Hawking, so you're not getting confused between the two names. And it was a brilliantly done program, wonderful colour and the stars and space and all the rest of it. I mean, it was absolutely brilliant. There's no telling how much money they spent doing it. And it began with a big hall and Hawking there crouched over his little chair, and that voice with the help of a voice synthesizer saying some very interesting things. And then you get a lot more colour and movement. Clearly he'd written the script. It sounded like him, but an actor with a good clear voice spoke it, and then back to a little bit more of Hawking, and then back to the other actor. I mean, it was very, very well done. And the program was called The Meaning of Life. And so we get towards the very end, and they zoom back to Hawking. I mean, it was very well produced and directed. And so Hawking says, so the meaning of life is, and I'm there with a pen poised, waiting for this statement. The meaning of life is whatever we choose to make it. And then he took a pause and said, so we are the creators of the universe. And that's it. So the meaning of life is whatever you choose to make it. But surely that answer is vastly different for people who live in vastly different circumstances. It is very different for a multi-millionaire than for someone living in the worst home in the most difficult of the townships here in South Africa. So you ask that person, what's the meaning of life? And he would give you an answer in terms of how many Learjets he's got. You ask another person, what's the meaning of life? The answer is likely to be very different. So for Hawking to say the meaning of life is whatever you choose to make it, surely it doesn't work. Well, has science got rid of God? You often hear that, well, science is a matter of facts and religion is a matter of faith, and so that's where the conflict is. Well, there's no conflict there at all, because science is impossible without faith. All scientists are believers. They are men and women of faith. Not necessarily of theistic faith, but of faith. For example, they believe that we live in a universe that can be examined, studied, and measured to some degree or other, that it works according to fixed laws. Einstein said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. That's the most amazing thing. We can actually take measurements, make observations, confirm that things are so. Secondly, scientists believe that the human mind can process the data it receives. They believe, they're believers, they believe their eyes are telling them the truth, that their mind is working correctly, and that these things therefore can be brought into some kind of order. Thirdly, they believe that logic is dependable. Without logic, science would be impossible. So scientists believe, what I'm trying to make here is they're people of faith, they believe that logic is dependable. Without logic, science would be sunk without trace. So they do believe that that is the case. So let's be clear. Science is primarily based on faith. There was a remarkable English scientist some years ago called William Henry Bragg, and one of the interesting things about him is that he and his son William Lawrence Bragg were joint Nobel Prize winners in 1915 for X-ray crystallography. That's just remarkable, possibly unique, and I'm not putting any weight on that, of father and son. However, lecturing at the British Institution, William Henry Bragg said this, quote, sometimes people ask if religion and science are opposed to each other. And then he added, and maybe people expected a different answer, they are, in the sense that my thumb and fingers on one hand are opposed to each other. It is an opposition by which anything can be grasped. It's a great statement. But the idea that science is superior to faith is pushed so hard that many would sooner stake their lives on technology than they would on theology. The story is told of an airline pilot who on a transatlantic flight came on to the passengers and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the pilot speaking, and I think it only fair to tell you that we have lost power in one of our engines. One of our engines is completely gone, so we shut it down." And you could almost feel the fear surging through the cabin. And he said, "But please don't be afraid. This plane has 4 engines, one of them is cut out. It is so built, the 3 engines will take us safely to our destination. There's absolutely nothing to worry about." Oh, and in case you are worried, I do have some good news. We got 4 bishops on board the plane. So I'm sure we are safe. And one of the passengers got a message back to the pilot saying, "It's all the same to you. I wish we had 4 engines and 3 bishops." So has science got rid of God? I mean, the God revealed in the Bible, the God who is unique and transcendent and the creator of all reality outside of himself, and who is sovereign over all of his universe, and the one to whom we must give account. Well, here is Peter Atkins again. Religion is outmoded and ridiculous. It's not possible to believe in God and to be a true scientist, unquote. Well, so much for the rhetoric. What about the truth? Because they are very different. All of today's scientists, whether they are theists who believe in God, or skeptics, or agnostics, or theists, or Christians, all of today's scientists are standing on the shoulders of some of the greatest scientists in the history of the world, who were, between them, among the most important founders of what we call modern science. I'll give you some examples. Francis Bacon, who eventually became the Lord Chancellor, first put forward the new theory then of scientific knowledge that became known as the inductive method. He was a believer. The Irish physicist and chemist Robert Boyle, commonly regarded as the father of modern chemistry, was a lay preacher. The British chemist and physicist Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction. He too was a believer. The British physicist James Joule, J-O-U-L-E, established or gave his name to Joule's law, which is still used today for calculating the heat produced by an electric current running through a wire. The German astronomer Johannes Kepler, acknowledged as the father of modern astronomy, wanted to be a Christian preacher. He frequently quoted the Bible in his work and said, "I'm only thinking God's thoughts after it." The British scientist James Clerk Maxwell has been called the father of modern physics, first predicted the existence of radio waves. The English mathematician and physicist Sir Isaac Newton, universally recognized as one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, was a believer. And the Scottish physicist William Thomson, the first Baron Kelvin, held the chair of natural philosophy at Glasgow University for 53 years, held 21 doctorates, and established the Kelvin scale of absolute temperatures. But Peter Atkins said, "You can't believe in God and be a true scientist." What is he talking about? When the Royal Society, the world's first prestigious scientific organization, was founded in 1662, its founders dedicated their work, and I quote, "to the glory of God." Today, the Human Genome Project, without its equal in all of human history, one of the greatest achievements of its kind. Its American director, Francis Collins, and I corresponded in the course of writing at least one of my books. And Francis Collins said he was, and these are his words, once an obnoxious atheist. And then, not least through the readings of C.S. Lewis, writing what C.S. Lewis had written, he became a Christian. And Francis Collins says this: "The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. He can be worshipped in the cathedral and in the laboratory." Global warming is one of the great issues facing men today. One of the leading workers in that field is Sir John Horton, a distinguished British scientist who is a committed Christian. I remember preaching in Science, tell them I'm busy. I remember preaching in church in England a little while ago, 300 in the congregation, 30 of whom were qualified doctorate-holding scientists in disciplines ranging from medicine to microbiology and from pharmacy to physics. But Atkins says you can't be a true scientist and believe in God. The fact is that true science points beyond its limits, and it points to the idea that God does exist. I am not saying, and never do say in any presentation, let me prove that God exists, or this proves that God exists. I think actually that's going too far. I think that's unnecessary, but I do think it's valid always to say to a person, where does the evidence point? And true science points beyond its limits and to the idea that God does exist. I'll give you two examples, one of them massive and the other microscopic. The massive is cosmology. 200 years ago, 300 years ago, we had a very limited idea as to what the size of the universe was. Today we know that our planet orbits around the sun, which is 1,000,000 times its size, and that this goes on in what Stephen Hawking delightfully calls the outer suburbs of an ordinary spiral galaxy, which measures millions upon millions of kilometers across, has 100,000 million stars in it, and is one of 100,000 million galaxies in the known universe. And that points towards a transcendent creator. In A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking says this, but he's looking for what he called a theory of everything. And that's a great phrase. Is there something that glues the whole thing together? And he says towards the end of the book, if we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. So at least at that point, he was opening the door to that possibility. Sadly, I think he's changed since then, and his latest book, I think, is called The Grand Design, and ironically, it comes to the conclusion that there's no design. So a book with the title The Grand Design says that there is actually no design, which I can find a bit odd. That I'm not a really good scientist. The minute thing is biology. 150 years ago, in Darwin's time, the scientists thought that the living cell was a simple blob of matter. Today we know that the tiniest bacterial cell is made up of 100,000 million atoms, and is much more complicated than any machine built by man. Now just think of that. Any machine built by man. Think of the most complicated machine built by man. One single bacterial cell is far more complicated. There is more information in the DNA of a single human cell than in the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, imagine that this is how the Encyclopedia Britannica came into existence, came to this earth. Somebody was walking along the waterfront one day and something fell out of the sky and he picked it up, and there was this thing in computer code, which when they analyzed it, ran it through, turned out to be the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, that's what I thought. Now, it doesn't matter who the person is as they assess that. They don't have to be a Christian or a theist or a believer in gods or gods. They can be the most irreligious, atheistic person in the world. Everybody in the world who had the intelligence to think about the subject would come to this conclusion. There must be superior, transcendent intelligence. Amen. Because out of the sky, it fell down here, the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, if the DNA in one single human cell contains much more intelligence than there is in the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, where does that point? Except upwards. That there must be transcendent intelligence that created such a thing. DNA points beyond the natural to the supernatural. And the Bible's testimony is that that supernatural is the greatest reality of all, the God who brought all other reality into being. And this is not a leap in the dark, because God has revealed himself in a number of ways, with all of which you will be familiar, but I want to take perhaps a little different approach on just one of them. So very briefly, firstly, God has revealed himself in creation. Atheistic science, as we've already seen, has no explanation for the existence of the universe. We are told that to have our universe, including our tiny little planet, 5 things are needed: time, intelligence, energy, space, and matter. What I find more than interesting is that the very first verse in the Bible has all 5. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning speaks of time, God speaks of intelligence, created speaks of energy, the heavens speaks of space, and earth speaks of matter. So how extraordinary. And science tells us we must have these 5 things or we can't have what we've got. And you open the Bible and the very first sentence you read covers all 5. Later on in the Bible we have that summed up in this wonderful phrase, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Listen to the testimony of Arno Penzias, who shared the 1978 Nobel Prize for Physics. Quote, "The best data we have," so here he is, this Nobel laureate in physics, "the best data we have is exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole." So here is saying, if this was all I had, and I read the Bible through, and then I looked around me, I would say, goodness, that's exactly what I would have expected according to this. I think that's hugely important. It's a very important testament. Secondly, of course, God has revealed himself in the Bible, so that in spite of 2,000 years of investigation and persecution and criticism, the Bible remains undented and unscarred. And I hope that as you proceed with your education here, that you will become more and more convinced that that is the case. Isaac Newton, again, some people will say the father of modern science, said this: "Scripture is a rock from which all the hammers of criticism have never chipped a single fragment." Unquote. So in its history, its prophecy, its morality, it stands head and shoulders above all other literature, and there is no human explanation for it. And thirdly, of course, God has revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth. Now let's assume that we don't have a New Testament. I'm with a group of people meeting together this morning, and somebody raises the fantastic, and I mean that word in its proper sense, the fantasy of an idea, that God became a man. I mean, what a crazy idea. God becomes a man. So we start discussing about what kind of man would he be? We're not talking about whether he'd be black or white or yellow or any other color, but what kind of person would he be? And someone, I guess, would be bound to say, well, he'd be very strong. I mean, he'd be powerful. If he became if God became a man, for example, he could change the weather if he wanted to. You know, for example, if you wanted to play golf this afternoon and it was pouring with rain, and God was on your side, you'd be in business. I speak with great passion about that. If he and you and others were out on the sea, and it got stormy, and you got scared, he could just speak a word, and the wind would drop, and the sea would be as flat as a car. Somebody said, yeah, that's right. Because if he was God, he could heal sickness, I guess. If he had a friend who was sick, if he was blind, he could open his eyes. If he was deaf, he could unstop his ears. If he was lame, like Mrs. Greener here, he could straighten those legs out, which I make no further comment. And he could do all of those things. Oh yeah. Something like an incurable disease, leprosy as it once was, incurable, and cure leprosy by a word. Someone said, "Tell you what," and this is really ridiculous, if somebody died, a friend of his died, and he was told about it, he could, if he was God, go along to the cemetery and speak of the dead person who come out of the grave. And then someone else would say, of course, I mean, if God became a man, because he's a man, we'd expect him to get tired and need to sleep and to eat and to drink and all the rest of it. We'd expect him to be tempted if he's a real human being. But he'd never fall into temptation. He'd never sin. He would be perfect. Everything he said and everything he did, he'd be perfect if he became a man. And then someone will say, I've got the craziest idea of all. If God became a man and for some reason he was killed, I mean he was knocked over by a camel, or something. Or a Cape Town taxi driver. Same thing. The other is more likely. Then he would come back to life again. I mean, if he was God and he was a man. And of course, you know exactly where this is going. You open the Bible and read about somebody who did all those things. He did change the weather. He did heal the sick. He did cure the incurable. He did rise from the dead. He did all of those things. And his name is Jesus. And there's the most amazing evidence in the Bible for the deity of Jesus. For example, forget everything I've said for the last 5 minutes. Of whom do you think these things could be said to be true? Through him all things were made, without him was not anything made that was made. He said, nobody further, that can only be said about God. I agree. But the words are said about Jesus. So that every form of matter in life, from stars to stem cells and dolphins to DNA, are in existence because of the power, the wisdom, the imagination of Jesus of Nazareth. Or this statement, in him all things hold together. I mean, a whole shooting match holds together in this person. You would say, only God can hold all of reality together. I agree. But the words are actually said about Jesus. That everything in the created universe, from the massive to the minute, is under his immediate and total control. Or this, in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. You say, well, only God has all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Not even a seminary professor has that. Only God, I agree. But the words are actually said about Jesus. So here are all these statements that can only be said about God, and they are said about Jesus of Nazareth, which surely points massively to his deity, and points to the reason why he came into the world. Because he didn't come into the world as a psychiatrist, an economist, a politician, a financial advisor. He came into the world to save sinners. He came to bear in his own body and spirit, as he died on the cross, the penalty for the sins which people like you and me deserve. And there's one single event in all of history that confirms that these things are true. And I was speaking at UCT a number of years ago, an atheist had all kinds of questions for me, and as I left him, had one for him, which is this: what do you think of Jesus Christ? And his reply, he's an atheist, saying, well, I'm not sure, but I do know this: everything hinges on whether or not Jesus rose again from the dead. Yeah, he was right. Everything hinges on that. And as you continue in your studies here, you'll be studying all kinds of subjects, including some I can't even spell. Hold this at the very center. Everything hinges on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Because if he didn't, I tell you this place is a farce. I don't know what in the world it was ever thought of. And it's only been here 40 years anyway, so it's quite young as far as I'm concerned. But and the whole idea of seminary and teaching people from the Bible, what a load of nonsense. If Jesus is just a pile of powdered bones somewhere a couple of meters underground in the suburbs of Jerusalem. But if he rose again from the dead, you're on the right track. You're on the right track. Lord Darling was a former Chief Justice of England, well used to the whole process of the judiciary system, and more than well used to examining evidence and coming to conclusions about it. And Lord Darling said this: there exists such overwhelming evidence, positive and negative, factual and circumstantial, that no intelligent jury would fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true. And we needn't have the remotest doubts that it is true. There's more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than the Romans ever did. There's evidence all over Britain that they did. The straightnesses of the roads. I mean, the Hadrian's Wall built between what we now call England and Scotland to keep out, as the Romans thought, these horrible barbarians from north of that point. depending now, it would be the Scottish ancestry in the room. But I know it's there. I've had my foot on the thing, so I know it's there. The Romans were in Britain. There's more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, and there's no more powerful evidence than that. Represented, not in its entirety, of course, represented in this room today. Lives that have been transformed, not by a political system, not by a religion, not by a philosophy, but by Jesus Christ, by a living Savior. Nobody is transformed by doctrine or theology or information or intelligence. It is the living Christ who has changed our lives and to whom we gladly reaffirm our loyalty and our commitment today. So, science and religion, those are hardly any more than a few thoughts on the subject, but I hope that they'll be of use to you. But I am fully aware in the whole of this tour, and have been so many years now, that, and every preacher should be aware of this, and it's rather daunting. 90% of what a preacher says will be forgotten by 90% of the people within 90 hours of hearing it. That's not a scientific statement, not even a statement made by a scientist. But what I mean is most things that most people say are forgotten by most people who hear them within a relatively short time, because we simply can't contain all that information. And that is why I'm a passionate believer in the power of the printed page, which is why I got involved in writing back in 1966. Wrote this little book called Read, Mark, Learn, which is a book of Bible reading notes for those beginning the Christian life. In those days, somebody became a Christian, we'd hand them a Bible or John's Gospel and say, God bless you. And I thought, what a strange thing. Why don't we give them the shortest Gospel and then write some notes that would help them to study it? And so I wrote these notes, called them Read, Mark, Learn, 45 notes going through the Gospel of Mark. And I've even known preachers use them as 45 sermon outlines. They picked this up and said, wow, that's my next 45 Sunday mornings covered, because they are notes, and there's sometimes alliterated outlines, and the whole thing is there. And then I followed that up with one called Luke Comes Alive, which, oh, here it is. And this has 62 outlines going right through the Gospel of Luke. And then someone said, are you going to cover all the other books in the Bible? You know, zip through Zephaniah and meander through Malachi and stuff like that. And I said, no, that's it. And it really, in terms of books like that, that's all it was. But others followed, and we have some of the titles left here, and it looks pretty derelict compared with what we started with. But Christian book discounters, and the key is in the last word, they do discount stuff in a, I think, in a very remarkable way. This is the latest book that I've written, booklet, called Anyone for Heaven. It begins with John Lennon's iconic song, Imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try, no hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today, which is what most people are doing. They're living for today, and they're forgetting there's an eternal tomorrow. And so this is all the booklets, or anything this size, they are evangelistic booklets to give to people who are asking those kind of questions. I was speaking at a breakfast this morning at an hour that I didn't think had ever been invented, and I was speaking on Meet the Real Jesus, and I did a lot of quotation from Dawkins, and so I said to the guys, you know, if you really want to put together this question of science and atheism and the central point of the Christian faith, which is Jesus of Nazareth, you ought to get hold of these two together. And I was able to tell them, because that's what CBD had done, you can get both books for $100 grand. And they were just, in fact, we ran out of that one this morning because so many people wanted it. But if that would be of interest to you, everything that I've ever studied about Jesus, I've crystallized into the book, Meet the Real Jesus. People say to me, look, why did you say that to me? When you are gone, why did they say that? You don't know well or something. When you're gone, which of all the books you've written would you like to be your legacy? And I've written, I think it's 35 or 37 at the moment. I would say that one. That's the one. Meet the Real Jesus. And so we put those two together, and that's what happened to them this morning. Now there are others. There's a commentary on James there called Truth for Life. And there's a biography written just recently by the wife of my good friend Howard Williams, sitting in the front row. And last year, which was the 50th year in full-time Christian ministry, they smuggled some information out of some records from somewhere. One of my sons provided some of the photographs, and she wrote this book called Hear Me Carefully, a phrase I think you've heard already once this morning. So that was published not quite a year ago yet, and I'm glad that CBD got some copies here on this trip to South Africa. So I think Nick and probably Janet and maybe even Howard, if he's needed, will take care of any of your needs there. And as I am constantly being asked in this trip, if you would like to sign any of those, if that would be of any interest to you, then I'll be happy to do that. But thank you for having me this morning.